The other day I saw a Reddit post which got me thinking about something that's come up pretty consistently over the years when it comes to discussions about aiming, which is the science behind it. And if you just want my opinion, it is that the science is interesting but not always useful when discussing how to improve your aim. Like, I see the value in discussing how learning takes place during sleep and using that knowledge to set reasonable expectations about when to see improvement, but I don't know why I'd want to know that the parietal cortex extracts spatial coordinates of the target. Just a random example there. To me, this kind of language only serves to obscure the important information when trying to communicate with a general audience, which is why I have avoided this topic in my videos, so far anyway. If there's good science, I will talk about it. It's important to remember as well that aim isn't something that has been studied extensively. This is almost all translated information from other fields, mainly neuroscience in this case. More importantly though, that science, or rather the appeal to it, is often used to prop up claims that don't have the backing in reasoning that they should. And I don't want to come off as too harsh on this post. It is apparently translated by an LLM, and we all know how badly they can fuck up sometimes. So maybe some of the more extreme claims here are a result of that, but I really dislike what this post is doing, and I want to talk about how wary we, as a community, have to be of claims like this. Now, the post itself. It starts with a foreword about how most aiming theories are just high-level players talking about their own experience, and very few break it down from a biology perspective. And then gives an example of a statement from Voltaic: in tracking, use your eyes to follow the target rather than predicting movement, which, in their words, is a fundamentally flawed idea from a neuroscience perspective. To go completely against the common consensus of essentially every top player like this takes some serious proof to back it up, so what do they have? The post immediately then goes on to claim, and I quote, "From seeing to moving your hand, there is over 200 milliseconds of neural transmission delay. This is a hard physiological limit that cannot be broken." I just broke it. I'm not even particularly fast either. My 80-year-old grandfather was able to get under 200 milliseconds on this test. They do not cite a source for this number or explain how they arrived at it, even though it is provably not true and absolutely needs something to back it up, since most people reading this can disprove it with a single click. This is a bad thing to mess up too, because they use this number as a reason why the conventional approach to flicking and tracking are fundamentally flawed. That 200 plus millisecond processing delay. Getting this number wrong is a big deal both for their argument and the credibility of this post. How do you claim to care about science and then make up a number? We will come back to this later, but moving on. The post then goes on to detail all of the parts of the body that are involved in the aiming process using terms that, let's be real, most people reading this post will not recognize. It also then explains some basic fundamentals like why practice makes you better, but through a biological lens. This is interesting, assuming it is all correct. After I wrote this, but before I recorded this, obviously, they left a comment saying that they did their research with an LLM. And apparently they checked the sources, but they haven't cited them here, so I don't trust anything in this anymore. Anyway, I personally don't see how any of this information goes against conventionally understood information about aim. The two can coexist, and I think they do. The most important part of the post is the discussion of flicks. So to quickly summarize and remove all of their jargon, they say the ideal way to approach flicking is spotting the target, processing the target's position, moving your mouse towards the target, and then stopping on them before clicking. Their broader point is that confirming after a flick or microadjusting is bad, universally, because of that aforementioned 200 millisecond delay, and that the ideal approach is just to flick and click with no hesitation. They also say that you cannot process any visual information during the flick without incurring this full delay, and for training flicks, they suggest playing scenarios making one smooth motion with no microcorrections whatsoever, and that because the cerebellum learns through errors, an accuracy of 85% is optimal. Again, I don't want to be too harsh, but this is not science. Yes, we do learn through making mistakes, but how does the poster establish 85% as the optimal accuracy for clicking tasks? It is almost universally agreed that higher accuracy is better for improvement. They're going against almost every established norm because the cerebellum learns through errors. 95% is too few errors. This is a massive leap of logic. Even if they had seen a study saying that the optimal error rate was 85%, they haven't discussed how to translate that into aiming. Is a missed flick an error? A missed shot after correction? How big are the targets in this example? This is very important when trying to use studies from other fields and translating them over, and this is entirely absent. Of course, I don't even know if they got this number from some study since it wasn't mentioned at all. They just talked about the cerebellum. This habit of replacing you with the cerebellum is very frustrating, honestly. It doesn't add anything to the discussion and only serves to obscure the fact that this person is pulling numbers out of thin air with zero justification. Most egregious point out of the way, let's go backwards through the rest of their points. I want to re-examine the idea of that 200 millisecond post-flick delay for any corrections. That because you cannot process visual information faster than you can flick, the only approach is to flick and shoot immediately. This statement completely ignores that you absolutely can assess the accuracy of a flick mid-movement even without visual information. I call this flick consciousness, and I'm sorry, I can't tell you if it's the cerebellum or the occipital lobe that's responsible for this one, but I can show you it happening. A lot, actually. The post states that our brains are predictive, and because of that, we have to trust their initial prediction completely. But our predictions are not static. We are constantly updating that prediction with new information, visual or not, and with enough practice, we can tell when we're messing up a flick shot mid-flick and correct for it in real time. Look at that, we didn't need the jargon after all. Maybe I should have mentioned the cerebellum 21 times. I also want to mention again that we are not talking about a 200 millisecond delay here. Looking at my own gameplay, it takes me an average of about 80 milliseconds to go from the end of my flick to the start of my microadjustments. Again, I am not a superhuman. I can't react in 80 milliseconds. So what's going on? Well, it turns out that we actually can use our eyes mid-flick after all. By releasing tension mid-flick, we will naturally start to slow down somewhat before the very end of our movement, often to a speed where it is completely possible to start assessing the position of our target with our eyes before the flick has ended. Xionlo's gameplay is the perfect example of this. He has a very exaggerated slowdown specifically to allow him to read the target's position earlier in the flick. He does this in game 2, by the way. This isn't only in aim trainers or anything. This is part of the problem with evaluating aim from a purely theoretical standpoint, especially when based off faulty assumptions. You end up drawing these, frankly, absurd conclusions about how we shouldn't use our eyes throughout the flick when clearly most good aimers do. You also end up with a far larger issue of completely dismissing all nuance from the equation. The question of should I microadjust or not is entirely situational. Have you just swung into an angle where someone is holding you and your pre-aim is off? You'll have to go for that reaction-based flick shot without any micro since they have the advantage. Someone appeared on your screen not looking at you. If you try to flick and click immediately, you are actively throwing the game. And that isn't even mentioning flick distance, which is equally important. You shouldn't ever really need to confirm this movement. It's safe to make quickly, but for this one, it might be worth slowing down at the end to increase your accuracy since your chances of hitting that initial flick are so low. A microadjustment is a trade-off between time and consistency. They do take some time, but increase your odds of landing any given shot significantly. Now, this does bring up an important factor though, which is that I do think there is an issue with the way people in the aiming community talk about hit confirmations. I have grouped them with microadjustments so far because this Reddit post does too for the most part, but I do think they are actually separate things. The conventional explanation for a wider flick in static clicking scenarios goes something like this. Flick, then micro, then confirm. I think this is actually a miscommunication of what's happening, which is more akin to flick, then confirm, then micro or click. You make your initial movement, check to see if it landed, then micro again if needed. Again, it gets a bit messy here because the confirm should start at some point towards the latter part of the flick, so maybe a check is a better term for it, but ignoring all of that, I think this miscommunication has led to people's issues with how people talk about confirmation. I see why you would think it would be pretty bad if it was actually a flat 200 millisecond delay at the end of everything, but it isn't. 80 milliseconds plus microadjustment time if needed is a very reasonable delay to increase the odds of an unlikely shot, in my opinion. Especially considering that this is less than the recovery time for the first shot with some weapons intact shooters, making it faster than shooting once after flicking and then correcting. That was what stood out to me on a first read, but when going through it again, I noticed so many of these unsubstantiated claims. A lot of them are obviously incorrect, like no pro player uses visual aim calibration, but it's most insidious with things I already agree with, where I'll just glance over a claim made with no justification behind it in a post that is, again, supposedly a scientific analysis. The entire passage about sensitivity offers no justification for anything, only statements and a mention of the cerebellum again to make it sound more scientific. Arm handles large movements, wrist handles fine adjustments. This is most rational. Why? Show the rationalization. It's so easy to as well. Arm move big, wrist move small. That's all it would have taken. This isn't only to prove that what you're saying is correct either. This is how you ensure that your readers walk away with an actual increase in understanding of why people do things the way they do. Okay, so why do I care? I think the majority of Reddit posts are bad. This isn't out of the ordinary. What gets me about this is how people respond to the aesthetic of science. The replies were all glowing praise. There wasn't a single person who questioned where he got any of those made-up numbers from. It's like the usage of these terms stops people from seeking rationalization for the claims being made. Like I said, everything in that post in terms of actionable aim advice is either pulled from thin air, like that 85% accuracy number, or built off of foundations that were pulled from thin air, like the 200 millisecond delay stat. But because it's framed as a scientific analysis, no one questioned it. A complete and utter dismissal of the value of experience and thinking about aim in exchange for a faulty theoretical framework was accepted with open arms because this guy said the cerebellum instead of your brain. And for clarity here, I am not anti-science. I completely understand the desire to want something concrete to refer to when talking about aim, and I want to see some actual science in aiming. Bardos is actually working on setting up some studies into the impacts of various factors at the moment, and I'm really excited to see how they turn out. That is actual science, drawing hypotheses and ideas based off what we've noticed, testing them and seeing what the results say. This post is not science. It is at best trying to use elements of biology to explain basic concepts, and at worst using faulty conclusions drawn from made-up data to make sweeping generalizations about how we should approach aiming, while dismissing those aforementioned hypotheses because they were only based on experience. The thing is though, this isn't the first time this has happened in this space. Generally, making blanket claims backed up by sheer confidence alone is incredibly common, but specifically invoking science has happened a few times too. The example that sticks out the most in my mind though was a few years back. So for some context, there has been an ongoing debate about metronomes and static clicking since, well, forever, that from my perspective was mostly ended when Bardos gave his take on the subject. The argument for them was that it helps you push yourself to go faster, and even if you did end up missing sometimes, you were still learning the pace that you had to aim at for a particular score. Bardos's thoughts were that they didn't work well, as you should try and keep a dynamic pace in static clicking, clicking faster for clusters and taking more time on wider flicks to ensure you didn't miss. Metronomes tended to lock you into a set pace, and you'd end up going way slower than ideal on clusters while also feeling pressured to flick faster than you were confident to on wider movements. In reply to this, Wes Proda creates a video titled "Why Metronomes Are Great for Aim Training, Bardos is Wrong," and his argument was that, scientifically speaking, you will flick faster using a metronome because of this podcast, bracket from neurobiologist, end bracket. Now, I haven't checked if what Andrew Huberman says on this podcast is correct. Bardos doesn't think it is, but was hazy on the details because it's been a few years. Thankfully, though, it doesn't matter if it is or isn't correct because you can't just take a principle from one field and say, this means you're wrong, while translating it to another, while not acknowledging the ways it doesn't translate whatsoever. There is no engagement with Bardos's argument at all. He essentially says to ignore clusters and hold a completely static pace, or ignore the metronome, which seems to defeat the purpose. Just like with that Reddit post, this is not science. This is using the aesthetics of science to make your arguments seem stronger than they actually are. I don't want to start drama with Wes Proda or anything. He isn't the only one who did this, and to his credit, he did make a follow-up video that I also don't think is very good. But regardless, he does acknowledge that this video wasn't great, and I'm just using him as an example since he's left the scene years ago and I don't think he will care. My reason for bringing this up is to make a point that as a community, we need to be more critical about information about AIM. I'm not arguing for every piece of information to be treated with doubt, but rather for people to really think about the ideas being put forward. On a most basic level, is whoever's speaking actually justifying and rationalizing their idea? And further, does that idea make sense? And like I said before, I don't just want this to prevent bad information from spreading. This approach is something creators should adopt as well for the good of their own videos. Showing your working, so to speak, makes your videos better. Knowing not just the what, but the why behind aiming techniques is how people actually grow their understanding. And presenting that reasoning lets them try to apply that same concept in other areas of aim. I always go through my scripts with a mind to this, making sure that I do actually explain why I think one approach is better than another. For example, knowing that players slow down at the end of flicks in static is only good for implementing that knowledge into your static clicking, but understanding why they do it will let you apply that knowledge elsewhere. You'll naturally come to the conclusion that since evasive target switching places more emphasis on reading the target, a technique designed to make reading the target mid-flick easier is even more important there than in static, and should be implemented in a more exaggerated form. I really do think that if you're a known and respected creator and you are confident enough in your idea to share it online, you should have already given it this level of consideration and thought. Double checking your ideas and making sure they do actually make sense should be a part of the ideation and script writing process anyway, so why not include it in the script? It helps people learn, makes your videos better, and building the expectation among viewers of justifications of ideas helps prevent people like this from using the concept of science as a shield against having their ideas interrogated. Thanks for watching.